What's good, YouTube? It's Rico here, and it's been a long time since I did a video like this where I just put the camera in front of me and just talk about my opinion on something. It's like a vlog. It's been a long time since I did that. I think it was I dabbled with it like 2, 3 years ago or something, and like around Dragon War format, and then I just kind of stopped doing it, and I just ended up going back to deck profiles. But this is something that I've always kind of wanted to do because I think I've played Yu-Gi-Oh long enough where I can formulate like well-educated opinions, and I like to get those opinions across. And it's kind of hard to do when I'm a featured writer for Pojo, but nobody really reads the main page of Pojo anymore, and it's hard to get your point across on a forum sometimes. So I don't know. This is always something that I've kind of wanted to do, just talk about my opinions on the game and stuff like that. And I figured now would be a good time to get into it because there is a topic that I've seen come up pretty frequently recently for, I guess, whatever reason, but I think I kind of know the reason why. And I've seen it pop up a lot on Pojo, and I've seen it pop up a lot on r/Yu-Gi-Oh. So now, granted, neither of those places are really known for their prestigious players. Like most of the top players flock to duelist grounds or Facebook, or they just don't talk on social media at all. So Pojo and Reddit, you don't really find top players there, but still they're very common places for people to talk about the game. And one thing I see it pop up fairly frequently, especially on r/Yu-Gi-Oh, is this is the title topic. I am returning to the game after blah 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 amount of time, like a year, 2 years, something like that. Does anybody else think that Pendulum is broken? And I don't think it's there anymore. Like I just went back to check it, but so it might have gotten deleted. But there was a post on Reddit this morning that was almost word for word that title. Literally, I am back from the game from blah 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 amount of time. Does anybody else think Pendulum is broken? And so I see varied responses. I see some people say yes, it's a very stupid broken mechanic. I see some people say no, it's not inherently broken. So I just thought I'd voice my opinion on it. Um, I think that by design, Pendulum is not a broken mechanic. I actually think it's it's actually a very balanced mechanic. It just happens to have broken stuff in it, and I'll elaborate on that. So, like I said, by design, Pendulum is not a broken mechanic. I The reason I think that is because when you look at it at face value, Pendulum is an inherent -2 to pull off because you need to set two pendulum scales, and ideally, if you're setting the pendulum monsters as pendulum scales, they're doing just that. They're being pendulum scales. They might have an effect, but they're not going to be scales and monsters at the same time or something like that. And ideally, they aren't generating advantage. I will get into that later on, is because there are pendulum monsters that do generate you advantage. So ideally, the pendulum monsters you set are -2s because they're setting up your pendulum zone, but they aren't doing anything else. So that's already a -2. And then you also have to think that if you don't have your extra deck set up, then you're not really gaining any advantage from the pendulum summon because everything's coming out of every monster you pendulum summon is coming out of your hand. And so there's no inherent advantage to the pendulum summon mechanic unless the monsters are coming from the extra deck, and it's already a -2 for setting the pendulum scales. And there's a huge risk versus reward factor to it also because there are a lot of cards that intercept the pendulum summon, like Bottomless Trap Hole, Time Space Trap Hole, Solemn Warning, Solemn Strike. A lot of things that can destroy things on summon and not send them to the graveyard or just negate the summon so they go to the graveyard anyway. If you pendulum summon and you get hit by that and you pendulum for 4 and you get hit by Solemn Warning, that is a massive blow to card advantage because you lose. If you summon from your hand, you lose all of that resource. If you summon from the extra deck, you lose all of that recursion, and it's really brutal to pendulum summon and then get hit by a negator. So now, granted, in the current meta, those aren't as popular unless you're playing Cosmo, but the fact is that by design, Pendulum has a risk versus reward factor to it, on top of the fact that it's inherent -2 because of the scales. And you aren't really gaining any advantage from a Pendulum summon unless you've summoned from the extra deck, which requires setting up your extra deck. So your Pendulum monsters have to reach the extra deck somehow, which is ideally if they die in battle, you can bring them back. Now, obviously, the game's not actually like that. So on paper, Pendulum's fine. In practice, would I say Pendulum is balanced? No, of course not. Pendulum in its current state is very overpowered, which is obvious in that Perform Age and Perform Repel is easily one of the strongest decks in the history of the game. I would argue that the only deck that rivals Perform Age and Perform Repel in like the game's history, the only thing that's come close to it, and I think is possibly better than it, is Full Power Dragon Ruler. And that's only in the TCG. In the OCG, I would argue that Performance and Pal was stronger because of the stronger rank 4 toolbox. So that's obvious. Like that was a very broken deck, and they nerfed it hard with the adjusted list and what the changes they did in the OCG, and it's still arguably the best deck. Like it still has a lot of plays. It has a lot of advantage. Has a lot of combos. So yeah, Pendulum in its current state is not balanced. I'm not going to deny that. It's more of just Pendulum mechanic as a whole is what I'm arguing for being balanced. And part of the reason I think that Pendulum right now is not balanced is because there are a lot of cards that accelerate the Pendulum's mechanic's game plan while not actually losing you advantage. So, like there are accelerators like Luster Pendulum, which destroys and replaces your opposite scale. So that's inherently a plus. Like it's a +0 at first, and then when you Pendulum summon, it becomes a +1, and then it just stacks up over time. Pendulum Sorcerer wipes your scales so your opponent can't deal with them, and then replaces them with 2 more Perform Repels, which are probably scales. So Pendulum Sorcerer ends up being a +2 because you can Pendulum summon back your scales later unless it was like Monkey Board Guitarl. Wisdom Eye Magician is another Pendulum monster that I think is inherently unbalanced because it destroys itself and replaces itself with another Magician. So that's a +1. And then Wavering Eyes is kind of a special case in that like Wavering Eyes is stupid for a different reason, which is that it makes every Pendulum mirror just like playing around Wavering Eyes, which how stupid that is depends on who you ask. A lot of people think that's really stupid. I think that's really stupid. But it also accelerates the game more because you can set scales Wavering Eyes, especially with no damage juggler anymore. You can set scales Wavering Eyes. If you have another scale, you set up more, which is like just it fuels the problem that Luster Pendulum, Pendulum Sorcerer, and Wisdom Eye cause. And it also becomes especially more powerful with the next set of cards, Pendulum monsters that I'm going to talk about, which are the Pendulum monsters that you set them and they search for another Pendulum monster, so they complete your scales. And those are, as far as I know right now, that's just Cliff Forest Scout and Perform Upon Monkey Board. But that's also just not a healthy card design in that like that ruins the part where the setting up Pendulum scales is inherently a -2 because you're setting one and then immediately searching out another one, and that kind of like ruins the point of Pendulum summoning being balanced out by the fact that it's a massive play, but there's a lot of risk behind it because you're minusing yourself, and Monkey Board and Scout are +1s. So like all of these cards are cards that I think in an ideal metagame would not be at 3. I would argue that Luster Pendulum and Pendulum Sorcerer are both ban worthy. Luster Pendulum partly for being an accelerator for like your other Pendulum monsters, and also for making Ignister incredibly easy to access. Pendulum Sorcerer obviously because he's actually a +2 on summon. Wisdom Eye I would argue would probably be limited like it is in the OCG because having multiple Wisdom Eyes just accelerates you a lot, but a single Wisdom Eye isn't that powerful honestly. Wavering Eye should obviously be banned. Clifford Scout I think is fine being limited, and like I'd honestly be okay with giving Clifford everything else back aside from the Floodgates and Towers as long as Scout stays at 1 because it's probably the least healthy card in the deck. And then I think Monkey Board should also be at 1 for a similar reason. It's just like these are the cards that actually inherently break the Pendulum mechanic. It's not Pendulum itself that's being. It's like the Pendulum mechanic itself isn't broken. It's these cards that make the mechanic accelerate faster than it has to. And then like I don't really know where to put Performance Plush Fire in this because I feel like Plush Power is broken for different reasons, mainly being a recurring floater that is really hard to get around. Like, so, uh, so the basic gist of all that is that Pendulum's not broken. There's just a bunch of cards right now that are breaking the Pendulum mechanic. And like if those cards are dealt with, then Pendulum becomes dealt with, and it becomes just like every other mechanic that at some point has had something broken. Because this is not a new complaint. This was said for Synchro when it came out. This was said for Xyz when it came out. It's like when when those mechanics came out, people would argue that they were so broken, like because they had things that broke the mechanic, but the mechanic wasn't inherently broken. And Synchro and Xyz are also inherently minuses. They just had things that made them stupid. Whereas like Synchro had Fishborg Blaster, Rescue Cat, for its time Dandelion and Global, and Spore were all broken. And then like there were also like stupidly powerful Synchro monsters like Darkstrike Fighter and Trishula. And like Trishula is not even inherently a +1. It's actually a like if you think of the 3 material it takes to summon Trishula and then you get the 1 Trishula and the +2 from ripping a card from your opponent's hand and from your field, Trishula is actually a +0, so it breaks even. It's just that at the time it was so easy to generate advantage in Synchro decks that made Trishula a problem. And then like Xyz also had it too. Xyz is also inherently a -1 or more depending on how many material the Xyz needs. But then you had stuff like Rescue Rabbit and Torgad, which made Xyz something so easy, and then you eventually had other, like the rank 4 toolbox got so out of hand, and like things like Exciton, Level Chain, Shockmaster, that just made the mechanic broken when inherently it wasn't. And like I would honestly argue that in a vacuum, Xyz is more problematic for the game than Pendulum because Xyz is so splashable. Like the only deck that can't really play Xyz monsters is Monarch, and that's because they have to have no extra deck for Domain to work. Like if Domain didn't exist, then Monarch could also play Xyz monsters. Is that Xyz is just by far the most splashable engine, and Pendulum's not a splashable mechanic, and like Synchro really isn't either anymore. So really, like Pendulum's really no more broken than the other ones, and that's because right now Pendulum is the one that Konami's trying to sell because it's the newest mechanic. They're gonna try and push it, and like that just happens every time. They post Synchro, they post Xyz, now they're posting Pendulum, and it took them a pretty long time. There was a good year where Pendulum was out and it didn't do anything. Pendulum took the longest time to actually take off compared to when it was released. Like Synchro was like immediately in the metagame the moment it came out, and then Xyz took about like a set or two before it finally took over the game. So Pendulum took a full year. That's 4 sets before Pendulum actually became really, really broken. And like it'll stay like this, and then it'll like wind down, like it always does. But like the Pendulum mechanic itself is not really that broken. Like it has things that balance it out. Where the most of the advantage, like you're not really getting advantage from the initial Pendulum summon because you're -2 for your skills. Your Pendulum summoning from your hand, so you're not actually gaining any advantage. And then like all the advantage comes from Pendulum summoning from the extra deck, which requires setup, which ideally would require the game to progress to the point where your monsters are starting to die, and then you can bring them back, and that's where like Pendulum synergizes with the Xyz mechanic, or not the Synchro mechanic, sorry, and that's where the advantage starts to come in. It's a trade-off for setting up. It's just that cards exist right now that break the mechanic, like Luster Pendulum, Pendulum Sorcerer, all the things that can destroy themselves and replace themselves with other Pendulum scales, and that's where the advantage comes from. And ideally, and I think eventually these cards will all be hit, Pendulum mechanic will balance itself out, and it'll just be another addition to the game, just like everything else. And then they're gonna, after the Arc 5 era, they're gonna release a new mechanic, and everybody's gonna bitch that it's broken, and then this whole cycle's gonna repeat because that's how it's been ever since they've introduced anything to the game. So, yeah, that's my gist on it. Yeah, thank you for watching, and if I kind of want to do like stuff like this where I talk about the game a bit more, because I feel like just constantly just posting deck profiles about like what my deck looks like, it kind of gets boring after a while. Like I do have an update to the Pendulum deck that I posted whenever the adjusted list came out, like not Magician, because I've started to like figure stuff out with like the rank 4-ish Pendulum, like Draco Pals, whatever. That's starting to work, but I don't want to post it yet, just because like it's like, oh, another deck profile. So like whenever like a topic like this comes up that I kind of feel like talking about, I'll probably just make a video about it. But probably won't have like a set schedule. But this is something I've seen pop up frequently. Is just like people returning to the game and seeing Pendulum saying, "Wow, this is broken." When you think about it, it's really not. And I actually, when Pendulum Mechanic was announced, I had this discussion with people I knew who had long since quit the game. Like they stopped in like the beginning of the Xyz era. Like when Dino Rabbit, Wind Up, and Zector was on review, that's when they stopped. And then like they'd come back and they'd try to argue with me that Pendulum was actually just a really stupid mechanic. I'm like, but you haven't actually played the game and you're not thinking about it. You're just seeing it and you're seeing that this is different and you're just assuming that it's bad when it's really not. Pendulum's actually a really interesting mechanic and it's not inherently broken. It's just stuff will break it right now and that's how it always is. Synchro was mad broken for years, and then like now is Synchro's hardly even there. Like the Synchro monsters that are relevant right now are Ignister and Naturia Beast, and then like maybe Cyform Lord Omega, but he's kind of falling out of favor. So like the only mechanic that's really stood the test of time is Xyz, and that's just because of how splashable it is, and they just keep pushing it harder, even though like it's not the most recent mechanic. So yeah, that's about it really. So I have no idea how long this video is, but yeah, that's basically my opinion on the pendulum mechanic. So thanks for watching, YouTube. I'll see you next time. Deuces.